The moldy sandwich hit Ethan Brooks's tray with a soft, damning thud right in the middle of Liberty Air's gleaming first-class cabin. Flight attendant Rebecca Hayes looked down at him without blinking. "That's all you get, sir," she said, her voice flat as glass. Around him, every other passenger cut into seared salmon and sipped wine poured to the rim. Only this man, 44 years old, still wearing a wrinkled shirt from his son's baseball game, held a plate that looked pulled from a forgotten corner of the break room refrigerator. No one saw his fingers quietly tap his phone beneath the table, triggering a monitoring system he himself had proposed 3 months earlier. Rebecca thought the curtain up front hid her contempt. She had no idea whose dignity she had just gambled with. 3 hours earlier, Ethan Brooks had been standing on a set of metal bleachers behind a chain-link fence, cheering so loudly his voice had gone hoarse. His son had struck out twice that afternoon, and then, in the bottom of the 6th inning, driven a line drive clean over the shortstop's head. Ethan had pumped his fist in the air like it was the World Series, his son turning to find him in the stands before even reaching first base, checking the way kids do, a faint smear of infield dirt on his sleeve, where he had hugged his son goodbye at the gate. Whether the moment counted only if someone was watching. Phone buzzing forgotten in his pocket, with 3 unanswered emails from a client who wanted an answer before markets opened on the West Coast. Business could wait 90 seconds. It always could when it mattered. Now folded into seat 2A of Liberty Air, flight 347, he still wore that same wrinkled dress shirt, the collar slightly damp from the summer heat. The drive from the ball field to the airport had taken 11 minutes longer than his phone promised, and he had spent most of it half listening to a colleague recap a deal update while watching the exit signs count down toward departures. He had made it to the gate with 8 minutes to spare, badge scanner beeping green, the gate agent barely glancing up from her screen as she waved him through, the kind that would mean nothing to anyone else on this flight. But it was the quiet infrastructure that let him show up anywhere. At all, the invisible scaffolding of favors and routines that made single parenthood function on days like this one. Before the cabin door closed, he had sent one last text to the babysitter who watched the kids on nights like this one, a retired school teacher named Mrs. Patterson, who lived 2 doors down and had a standing rule that bedtime happened at 8:30, no matter what. Landing by 10, he wrote, "Tell them I said goodnight twice." Her reply came back before he could switch his phone to airplane mode. Already did. Fly safe. It was a small exchange, and a version of himself that showed up to business meetings looking like he had just come from somewhere else entirely, because he usually had. His backpack sat wedged under the seat in front of him, and if anyone had bothered to look inside, they would have found a half-eaten granola bar, a small plastic dinosaur that belonged to his 6-year-old daughter, and a crayon drawing she had pressed into his hand that morning. It showed 2 stick figures holding hands under a yellow sun with the words, "Dad and me," written in uneven block letters. He had tucked it into his laptop sleeve like it was a boarding pass of its own. At 44, Ethan ran a private investment firm out of San Francisco, the kind of quiet, unglamorous success that never made headlines, but moved real money. 3 years earlier, his wife Sarah had died after a short illness, and in the months that followed, Ethan had learned to be 2 parents stitched into one exhausted person. He no longer traveled light. Every trip meant a calendar juggled around school pickups, a babysitter on standby. What none of the passengers boarding around him that evening could have guessed was that Ethan was also one of Liberty Air's private investors, a man who had sat across the table from the airline's executive board 18 months earlier and insisted in a voice that left no room for negotiation that they overhaul how first-class passengers were treated. He had not made that argument as an investor studying spreadsheets. He had made it as a father who once flew across the country alone with 2 small grieving children only weeks after burying their mother, and had been looked at by a flight crew as though he were an inconvenience rather than a man barely holding himself together. His firm's stake in Liberty Air had started, if he was honest with himself, as an ordinary allocation 2 analysts had recommended during a routine quarterly review. What kept him engaged with it long after the numbers looked fine on their own was harder to explain. In a pitch deck, a stubborn personal conviction that an airline could be measured by more than its margins, that how it treated the most exhausted version of a passenger said something true about the company underneath the branding, that maybe next time he should consider a later flight when things were less busy. He had wanted to explain that there was no later flight, that his wife's funeral had been 2 days earlier, that he was doing the very best any human being could do. Instead, he had said nothing, because saying something back then had felt like one more thing he did not have the strength to carry. He had promised himself on the connecting flight home from that trip that if he ever held real influence over how airlines treated the people passing through their cabins, he would use every bit of it. 18 months later, sitting in a conference room lined with framed route maps, he had made good on that promise in front of executives who likely assumed he was speaking about efficiency and cost, not about a 5-year-old who had gone quiet somewhere over Nebraska. The boarding process had run later than scheduled that evening, the gate crew still finishing paperwork on a cargo shipment, while passengers filed down the jet bridge, though it was the kind of routine delay nobody settling into their seats gave a second thought to. The first-class cabin smelled faintly of warm leather and fresh coffee, the kind of understated luxury that made a late departure feel less like an ordeal. He could still remember the shape of that flight if he let himself. His daughter, not yet 3, had cried through most of the boarding process, and his son, barely 5, had gone silent in the particular way children go silent when they sense something is wrong but don't have the words for it. A flight attendant on that trip, a different airline, a different city, had sighed audibly while handing him napkins and told him not unkindly, but not kindly either. And overhead, bins clicked shut one by one as the last passengers found their rows. Ethan certainly didn't think twice about the delay. He had a window of exactly enough time to close his eyes for a moment and picture his daughter's face when he called to say goodnight. He did not have to wait long for an answer to the question he had really come here to ask. That memory had never fully left him. It was part of why tonight he chose to say nothing about who he was. He wanted for one flight to simply be a passenger. He wanted to see without his name or his title attached to it, whether the standards he had fought for actually lived inside the cabin or only inside a policy binder somewhere in a corporate office. Sometimes on flights like this one, he found himself running through the ordinary things he missed most. The particular way Sarah used to reorganize his suitcase behind his back, insisting he would thank her later, or how she could calm a fussing toddler with nothing but the low hum of a lullaby half remembered from her own childhood. He did not allow himself many minutes for that kind of remembering during a normal week. Tonight, waiting for his tray to arrive, he allowed himself 2. Around him, the other first-class seats filled steadily, a couple sharing a tablet screen between them, a college-aged passenger, in a blazer, a size too large for his shoulders, a woman in her 60s settling in with a paperback and a cup of coffee balanced on her armrest. Ordinary people on an ordinary evening, the exact kind of evening Ethan had spent a year and a half trying to make identical for everyone who boarded, regardless of what they happened to look like when they sat down. The man in the blazer nodded a polite hello as Ethan settled into Tua, the kind of small, wordless courtesy strangers extend to each other before a long flight. And for a moment, Ethan let himself hope that tonight might simply be an uneventful 6 hours in the air, nothing more complicated than a meal and enough sleep to function through tomorrow's first meeting. Something in her expression shifted subtle and quick, the kind of judgment that never announces itself out loud, but settles into the way a person is served. The flight attendant working his side of the cabin introduced herself as Rebecca Hayes, and she moved through the first-class aisle with the practiced ease of someone who had done this job for years. Her uniform pressed sharp, a clipboard tucked against one hip. Her eyes swept over Ethan once taking in the wrinkled shirt the backpack stuffed with a child's belongings, instead of a garment bag, the general air of a man who had rushed to make his flight rather than glide onto it. When the meal service began, Rebecca placed trays in front of the passengers on either side of Ethan first. A woman across the aisle received seared salmon with a citrus glaze, a warm dinner roll, and a glass of red wine poured almost to the rim. The man beside her got the same plus a second roll when he asked for one. Ethan waited, watching the cart make its way down the aisle until Rebecca finally reached his row and set down a plate wrapped in plastic. "That's all you get, sir?" she said, her tone flat, already reaching for the next tray on her cart before he had a chance to respond. Ethan lifted the plastic wrap slightly and turned the sandwich so she could see the mold along the crust. "This isn't a category issue," he said. "This bread has gone bad. I'm not asking you to make an exception. I'm asking you to look at what's actually on this plate." Inside the plastic wrap was a sandwich with a faint gray-green bloom creeping along the edge of the bread, the kind of discoloration that no amount of dim cabin lighting could hide once you were looking for it. And beside it, a small cup of apple juice that had clearly been sitting out long enough to lose its chill. Ethan looked at the plate, then up at her. "I think there might be a mix-up," he said. "I actually pre-ordered a meal for this flight, the grilled chicken option." Without a word, he slid his phone from his jacket pocket and opened the Liberty Air app beneath the edge of his tray table, tapping a small icon in the corner of the screen that most passengers never noticed. It was a compliance reporting feature he had proposed just 3 months earlier, a quiet addition to the broader service standards he had helped rewrite 18 months before that. Rebecca glanced at her tablet without much interest. "We're out of that," she said. "This is what's left." He gestured toward the tray in front of the woman across the aisle. "That looks like what everyone else is getting." Rebecca's expression cooled by another degree. "That's a different meal category, sir." She said the word "sir" the way some people say a name they don't respect. "This is what's available for your seat right now." For a moment, Rebecca's jaw tightened, and when she spoke again, her tone had shifted into something practiced and dismissive, the voice of someone used to smoothing over complaints without solving them. "I'll see what I can do," she said, though she made no move to actually do anything. Then, almost as an afterthought, she added, "You know, a lot of people would just be grateful to be sitting up here at all." The words landed with a small, precise sting. Ethan felt something tighten behind his ribs, not quite anger, yet but its early cousin. He thought of his son at the plate that afternoon, swinging through 2 strikes before finally connecting, and how he had told him more than once that the moment you let someone treat you like less than you are, you teach them it's allowed to happen again. He thought of his daughter's crayon drawing tucked against his laptop sleeve, and what kind of father he wanted to be able to look at that picture and still respect, built specifically to flag a cabin interaction in real time and preserve whatever the onboard cameras and audio system had already captured. He had insisted on keeping it invisible to crew members entirely, so that no one would ever be able to perform politeness only when they suspected they were being watched. Rebecca never glanced his way as he did it. He thought of the version of himself who had once sat in economy with 2 children crying quietly beside him, too depleted from grief to advocate for anything, and how badly he had wished back then that someone with actual power would have looked at his family and simply cared. He was no longer that man without power. He was a man who had spent 1.5 years building a case for exactly this moment. He weighed his options in the space of a few seconds. He could let it go, eat around the mold, chalk the whole thing up to 1 bad flight and 1 indifferent employee, and be the kind of passenger who caused no trouble. Airlines rewarded passengers like that with nothing more than being left alone. Or he could press the small illuminated button above his head, the one that would summon someone back to this row and risk becoming, in the eyes of the crew, exactly the label Rebecca seemed ready to pin on him: difficult, demanding a problem. He had spent enough years in boardrooms to know that the second option always cost more up front and paid better in the long run, even when nobody around him could see the ledger. He thought, too, of every passenger who would board this same route long after tonight, people who would never know his name or what he had once argued for in a boardroom. Even if he hadn't known it would arrive wrapped in a moldy sandwich on a Tuesday evening flight to San Francisco, and how the only real test of the standards he had championed was whether they held up when nobody powerful was watching. Ethan reached up and pressed the call button. A soft chime sounded above his seat, and the small light switched on, steady and undeniable. Rebecca's eyes flicked toward it, then back to him, something unreadable passing behind her expression. Somewhere behind the curtain, separating first class from the rest of the cabin, footsteps started moving in their direction, and Ethan settled back into his seat, aware that whatever came next, he had chosen not to stay silent. Kevin's smile thinned, but didn't disappear. "Maybe it's just the lighting," he said, glancing toward Rebecca, as though hoping she would back him up. She didn't nod out loud, though. She didn't correct him either. "It's not the lighting," Ethan said, holding the sandwich up another inch. "I'm happy to wait while someone else takes a look if that would help." The footsteps belonged to Kevin Miller, the second flight attendant working the forward cabin, who arrived at Ethan's row with the kind of tight, efficient smile people wear when they've already decided whose side they're on. Rebecca filled him in quickly, her voice pitched just low enough to sound discreet, and just loud enough for Ethan to hear every word. "He's saying the sandwich isn't good," she said, though her tone suggested she found the claim faintly ridiculous. Kevin looked down at the tray, gave the sandwich the briefest glance, and then looked at Ethan, the way a person might look at someone trying to return a shirt without a receipt. "We do get this. Sometimes," he said, not quite to Ethan, more in Rebecca's direction, like they were sharing an old joke. "Folks think if they make enough noise, we'll comp them something extra. It's happened twice already this month," he added, as though frequency alone was proof that the current complaint could not possibly be legitimate. Neither Kevin nor Rebecca moved to actually inspect it. Instead, the flight's purser, Angela Reed, appeared from the galley drawn by the small cluster forming near row 2. She had the calm, rehearsed manner of someone who had spent years absorbing other people's frustration before it could reach the rest of the cabin, and she crouched slightly beside Ethan's seat so their conversation would feel more private than it was. Ethan kept his voice level, though the accusation landed exactly the way it was meant to. "I'm not asking for anything extra," he said. "I'm asking for what I already ordered, and I'm telling you this bread has mold on it." He turned the plate, slightly angling it, so the gray-green bloom along the crust caught the cabin light. "That's not a matter of opinion. You can see it from where you're standing. I understand there's been a mix-up with your meal, sir," she said. "Let me see what we can do to make this right." "I understand you have a job to do," Ethan said, "and I'm not trying to make it harder than it needs to be. But quiet isn't the same as right. Those are two different things, and I'd like this handled as the second one." Angela's polished calm didn't return. "Sir, I have 11 other rows to get through," she said. Quieter now, almost pleading. "I really am trying to help you. I'd like an actual resolution," he said, "not a smaller sandwich in a nicer bag. We can offer you this instead," she said, setting it down like the matter was settled. Ethan looked at the tray, then back at her. "This isn't the same as what I ordered," he said. "This is a downgrade. You're asking me to accept less than what I paid for because the crew made a mistake." Angela's expression flickered, the polished calm cracking slightly at the edges. "It's the best solution we have available right now," she said. "I'd really appreciate it if we could resolve this quietly." For a moment, Ethan felt something loosen in his chest, a small, cautious relief that someone was finally going to listen. That relief did not last. Angela straightened up, and after a brief exchange with Kevin near the galley curtain, returned with a tray from business class. Instead, a plain chicken wrap and a bag of pretzels, the kind of meal that came standard several tiers below what Ethan had actually paid for. "I believe that," Ethan said. "But trying isn't the same as succeeding, and right now, all you've done is offer me less for the same price." Angela's eyes flicked briefly toward the rows behind him, gauging how many people were listening, and something in her posture stiffened further, as though the audience mattered more to her in that moment than the actual plate on his tray. And Ethan was suddenly aware that this had stopped being a private matter between him and two flight attendants. The word quietly struck Ethan harder than she probably intended. He understood in that instant that the goal was never to fix the problem. The goal was to make the problem stop being visible. He thought of every version of himself that had once accepted a smaller portion of respect, just to avoid being labeled difficult, and of what he wanted his children to see modeled by their father, not tonight's silence, but tonight's honesty. By then, several passengers nearby had stopped pretending not to listen. A man 2 rows up had turned halfway around in his seat. A woman across the aisle set down her wine glass. Somewhere further back, a couple exchanged a look that said, without words, that they had just decided which version of tonight's flight they would tell their friends about. The cabin, small and enclosed as it was, had a way of making even a quiet disagreement feel like a performance. He spoke instead to Angela low and clipped, and whatever she told him seemed to confirm something he had already decided before leaving the flight deck. Lawson's jaw tightened. "This is my aircraft, and I decide what constitutes a disruption on it," he said. "Consider this your final warning. If this continues, I'll have no choice but to involve airport security before we depart." He said it the way a man says something he has said before and never once had questioned back to him. It was at that point that the cockpit door opened, and Captain Richard Lawson stepped out, drawn by whatever version of the story had reached him through the interphone. He was a tall man, with silver hair and the unbothered posture of someone used to being the final word on any aircraft. He commanded his uniform jacket buttoned with the kind of precision that suggested he had never once questioned his own authority in it. And he walked straight to row 2 without addressing Ethan first at all. Not in this moment. He said nothing further, and Lawson took the silence as compliance, turning on his heel and disappearing back through the cockpit door. Sir Captain Lawson said, turning to Ethan, "At last. I'm hearing that you're refusing the solutions my crew has offered and continuing to escalate a situation that should have been resolved by now." Ethan felt the ground shift beneath the conversation, the way an argument about a moldy sandwich had somehow in the space of a few minutes become an argument about his behavior instead of the crew's mistake. "I haven't raised my voice once," he said. "I've asked for the meal I ordered, and I've pointed out that the food I was given wasn't safe to eat. That's the entire complaint. Nothing about that has changed since you walked out of that cockpit. The cargo paperwork delay from earlier had still not cleared, which meant the doors remained open and the jet bridge still connected, and airport security was very much able to walk on board within minutes of the call going out." A ripple of silence spread through the nearby rows, the kind that comes when strangers realize they are witnessing something they will talk about later. Somewhere near the back of the cabin, someone had already begun typing quietly on their phone, though whether it was a text to a spouse or a note for later, no one nearby could tell. Ethan sat very still, aware of how quickly the story had been rewritten around him, aware that a captain's word carried a weight his own simply didn't. Not yet. 2 officers arrived within minutes, moving down the aisle with the brisk, neutral energy of people responding to a call they hadn't yet fully understood. A few passengers further back straightened in their seats at the sight of uniforms moving up the aisle, the word security passing between rows in the hushed, urgent way news travels on a grounded plane. The one who reached Ethan's row first introduced herself as Officer Marlene Carter, and unlike Lawson, she didn't begin with an accusation. She crouched slightly the way Angela had, but her questions were different in shape entirely. "Can you walk me through what happened?" she asked, looking directly at Ethan rather than past him. When she finally turned to them and asked what had prompted the initial complaint, Kevin started to answer. First, something about miscommunication during a busy service, but Marlene held up a hand and asked instead, calmly, Whether either of them had actually looked at the food in question before offering a replacement, neither had a clear answer. She jotted a brief note in a small notebook without looking up, the kind of unhurried patience that came from years of learning, that rushing a room rarely produced the truth any faster. He explained it plainly, the pre-ordered meal that never arrived, the mold along the sandwich crust, the offer of a downgraded tray in its place, the captain's warning that followed a complaint he had made without raising his voice. Marlene listened, without interrupting, occasionally glancing toward Rebecca and Kevin, who stood near the galley with the stiff posture of people aware they were now also being evaluated. Another passenger, an older man near the bulkhead, who had said nothing until then, added simply that he agreed, and that he had never seen a passenger stay so calm through something so clearly mishandled. Marlene noted each name as it came, thanked the passengers for speaking up, and reminded the cabin gently that she still needed to hear directly from the crew before drawing any conclusions of her own. A woman seated across the aisle in a soft cardigan added her own voice before Marlene could ask. "I saw it too," she said. He was polite the entire time. It was the flight attendant who got sharp with him, not the other way around. And when he asked for what he'd already paid for, they treated it like an insult. Robert Wittman glanced at the woman beside him, with something like solidarity. Both of them clearly relieved someone else had spoken first. "Honestly, people like that always try to talk their way into more than what they paid for," she said. "He shows up looking like he rushed here from somewhere else and expects to be treated like he owns the plane." The words landed in the cabin like a dropped glass, sudden and impossible to take back. Several passengers turned fully around in their seats. Kevin took a half step back from her, as if putting distance between himself and the sentence might undo the fact that he had been standing beside her when she said it. Marlene's expression didn't change, but her attention sharpened visibly, and Ethan understood with a strange, cold clarity. Before Marlene could press further, a voice came from the row behind. A man in a gray sport coat leaned forward close enough to be heard without shouting. "I've been sitting right here the whole time," he said. "My name's Robert Wittman. I fly this route for work most weeks. This man ordered a specific meal, showed the crew the mold himself, and never once raised his voice. I watched the whole thing." A recording already marked for priority review the moment Ethan's flag had gone through minutes earlier. Rebecca's composure, which had held reasonably well up to that point, began to slip. She glanced toward Kevin, then back at the small crowd of witnesses now speaking on Ethan's behalf, and something in her expression tightened into defensiveness. When Marlene asked her directly what had prompted the original complaint, Rebecca's answer came out faster than she seemed to intend, edged with an irritation she no longer bothered to hide. That Rebecca had just said out loud, the assumption that had shaped every interaction since he sat down, the quiet verdict she had reached about him before he'd said a single word. What she didn't seem to register in that moment was the small camera mounted near the forward galley for crew training purposes. Its lens angled just enough to have caught her face, and the overhead microphone system that had picked up every syllable clearly enough to matter later. For a long moment nobody spoke. Ethan felt the old familiar pull to simply let it go, to accept the apology that would eventually be offered, and move on with his evening. But he thought again of his son at the plate that afternoon, of the crayon drawing pressed into his laptop sleeve that morning, of every quiet moment over the last 3 years, where he had chosen to advocate for his children because no one else would. He was tired of being patient with people who mistook his patience for permission. He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a plain white business card, setting it on the tray table in front of him with the same unhurried calm he might have used to sign a contract. "Officer Carter," he said, "my name is Ethan Brooks. I'm a private investor with a significant stake in Liberty Air, and 18 months ago I sat on a panel that helped rewrite this airline's first-class service standards. I'd like the captain to hear what I'm about to say, because I don't think he understood who he was speaking to a few minutes ago, and frankly, that shouldn't have mattered in the first place. No passenger on this aircraft should have to prove who they are before they're treated with basic decency. signaled to her partner to summon the captain back out. The card sat there under the cabin, lighting small and unremarkable in appearance, and yet its effect on the row was immediate. Rebecca's face drained of color, her hand tightening around the edge of her cart, as though she needed something solid to hold on to. Kevin looked as though he wanted very badly to be somewhere else. Marlene Carter picked up the card, studied it, briefly turned it over, as if checking for something on the back, and then without a word, "We're not pushing back from this gate," he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. Then louder to the crew gathered near the galley, "Hold the aircraft. I need to speak with corporate right now." When Richard Lawson reappeared and was handed the card, Ethan watched something in the man's posture collapse inward, the easy authority from minutes earlier, replaced by the stiff, careful stillness of someone recalculating everything he'd just done. Lawson read the card twice, as if a second look might change what it said, and when he finally looked up at Ethan, his voice had lost every trace of its earlier certainty. A woman who had built her entire career on handling situations exactly like this one, before they became something a lawyer or a journalist could turn into a headline. The flag that reached her desk had come in within seconds of the incident, beginning rooted through the same compliance reporting feature Ethan had proposed 3 months earlier, a detail she recognized immediately since she had personally signed off on its rollout. The call from the flight deck reached Liberty Air's operations center within minutes, and from there, it climbed fast enough that by the time a response arrived at Gate 41, it did not come from a customer service supervisor or a duty manager. It came from Diane Bennett, the airline's senior director of legal and employee conduct. "Mr. Brooks," she said, "I want to apologize to you directly before we do anything else. What happened here tonight does not reflect what this airline says it stands for, and I intend to find out exactly how far that gap goes." Across the cabin, passengers who moments earlier had been trying not to stare now made no effort to hide it, watching a captain's authority fold in real time over something that had started with a single sandwich. Somewhere in the back galley, another flight attendant on this same crew, uninvolved in the entire exchange, quietly texted her supervisor that something serious had just happened up front, unsure if she would still have a job by the time they landed. Though on Diane it looked less like performance and more like habit worn smooth from years of practice, watching the technician work as though she might still find a way to intervene, though there was nothing left for her to do but wait. She boarded through the jet bridge with 2 colleagues trailing behind her, a laptop bag over one shoulder, and an expression that gave away nothing, though anyone who had worked with her long enough knew that stillness in Diane Bennett usually meant she had already made up her mind about how a situation would end. She did not stop to speak with Captain Lawson first. She walked straight to row 2 and crouched beside Ethan's seat, the same posture Angela and Marlene had used before her. Ethan appreciated the directness, though he had learned enough about corporate apologies over the years to withhold judgment until actions followed the words. "I'd like to see this handled properly," he said. "Not just for me, for whoever the next passenger is who doesn't happen to carry a business card that changes how fast people listen." Diane nodded once and then turned her attention to the crew still gathered near the galley. She asked for the training camera footage to be pulled immediately, along with the overhead audio from the past 20 minutes, and a young ground technician who had come aboard with her connected a small tablet to the system and began transferring the files, while the cabin sat in an uneasy hush around them. Rebecca stood near the curtain, with her arms crossed tightly over her chest. While the footage played, one of Diane's colleagues pulled up something else on a separate screen, a summary of internal complaint records tied to this specific crew rotation. It showed a pattern that had apparently existed for longer than anyone at the gate that evening wanted to admit. Multiple passengers over the past year had filed complaints describing similar treatment comments about appearance assumptions, about which passengers truly belonged in first class. The footage confirmed everything the witnesses had already said aloud. It showed Ethan calmly pointing out the mold on the bread. It showed Rebecca's dismissive tone, Kevin's insinuation about passengers trying to talk their way into extras, and most damning of all, Rebecca's unguarded comment about people like that, showing up looking like they'd rushed from somewhere else and expecting to be treated like they owned the plane. Diane watched the clip twice without any change in her expression. Diane turned to Captain Lawson, who stood near the cockpit door, with the stillness of a man watching his own authority dissolve in real time. "You had 3 prior complaints about this exact crew configuration," she said. "Did you know that when you decided to call security tonight, instead of listening to the passenger, Lawson's answer came out quieter than anything he had said all evening? I wasn't aware of the full history," though her jaw set a little tighter the second time through. Kevin stood off to the side during the playback, staring somewhere past the screen entirely, as though not watching might somehow keep the words from having been said. When it ended, she asked Rebecca evenly whether she remembered saying those words. Rebecca opened her mouth to answer, and then closed it again, apparently deciding there was no version of an answer that would help her. Service that quietly downgraded without explanation. 7 complaints in 11 months across the airline's first-class cabins, according to the summary. On screen, 3 of them tied to this very crew, each one closed within 48 hours, with a boilerplate apology and a travel credit never flagged as a pattern, because no one had been required to look for one. Each complaint had been logged, and each had been closed without any real consequence, filed away as isolated incidents rather than connected data points. One of Diane's colleagues murmured something about liability exposure, and Diane cut him off without raising her voice, telling him this was not the moment to think about the company's exposure, only about what had actually happened to the man sitting in seat 2A. Diane read through the summaries in silence, her expression growing harder with each one, until she finally closed the laptop and looked up. "That's part of the problem," Diane said. "Authority on this aircraft was never supposed to mean the final word gets to overrule the facts." She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She informed Rebecca, Kevin, and Captain Lawson, standing there in front of the very passengers who had witnessed the entire exchange, that all 3 were suspended, effective immediately pending a full review. Rebecca's composure finally broke completely, her eyes filling as she started to explain herself. Something about a long shift and misreading the situation, but Diane held up a hand, not unkindly, and told her this was not the moment for that conversation. Kevin said nothing at all, staring at the floor of the galley as though it might offer an exit. He couldn't find anywhere else. Angela stood a little apart from the other 3, her own conduct still under review, though not for now, grounds for suspension. She had at least tried, however inadequately, and would spend the coming weeks retrained rather than removed. Lawson removed his captain's insignia from his uniform himself without being asked, and handed it to one of Diane's colleagues before walking off the aircraft. The new attendants moved through the aisle with quiet efficiency, replacing trays, refilling glasses, checking in with passengers by name where they could. When one attendant reached Ethan's row, she set down a fresh plate-grilled chicken, exactly as he had originally ordered, along with a small side of fruit he hadn't even requested, and asked if there was anything else he needed before takeoff. He told her there wasn't, and meant it. A new crew boarded within the hour, led by a captain named Linda Marshall, a woman with an easy, unhurried warmth that seemed to settle the cabin the moment she stepped through the door. She introduced herself over the intercom, acknowledged that passengers had witnessed something unacceptable that evening, and promised that the remainder of the flight would reflect the airline's actual standards, rather than the failure they had just watched unfold. His footsteps unusually slow for a man who had commanded the space so completely less than an hour earlier. Nobody in the cabin said a word as he passed, though a few passengers watched him go the way people watch a storm finally clear the sky, though the simple gentleness of the gesture landed with more weight than the meal itself. Ethan agreed, and once the aircraft leveled off at cruising altitude, Captain Marshall handed the intercom microphone back to the cabin crew, who brought it to his seat. He did not stand. He simply spoke his voice, carrying through the small speakers, in a tone that was calm rather than triumphant. Before the doors closed for departure, Diane returned to Ethan's row one more time and asked with what seemed like genuine hesitation whether he would be willing to say a few words to the cabin once they were airborne. "Not required," she said. "But I think the passengers who watched this happen deserve to hear how it's being resolved from you rather than from us. What someone deserves based on nothing more than how tired they look walking through a door." He asked the cabin for nothing in return, no applause, no forgiveness on the crew's behalf, only that if any of them ever found themselves on the other side of a moment, like this one, as the person doing the judging rather than the person being judged, they would remember tonight before deciding what someone else deserved. He introduced himself, briefly explaining his connection to the airline, only enough for context, and then told the cabin in plain terms what had happened at the gate. He did not dwell on anger. Instead, he told them something he had not planned to share that years earlier. Not long after losing his wife, he had flown alone with his 2 small children on a flight much like this one, exhausted and barely holding himself together, and had been treated by a crew back then as though his grief and his tired, mismatched clothes made him less deserving of basic respect. He said he had spent the years since trying to make sure no one else on this airline would have to feel what he felt that day, and that tonight had shown him there was still real work left to do. He told them, too, that the point was never about one bad sandwich or one difficult crew, but about how easy it is for any of us to decide in half a second, and that the review would be conducted by an outside team rather than handled quietly in-house. A few passengers applauded softly. Most simply sat with the quiet, thoughtful attention of people who understood they had witnessed something larger than a bad meal. In the weeks that followed, Liberty Air's board convened an emergency session, and the changes that came out of it went further than a single flight's aftermath. New training protocols were introduced across every crew base, focused specifically on unconscious bias in passenger treatment. The overhaul also included a standing requirement that any complaint involving a suspended employee be reviewed by someone outside that employee's direct reporting chain, and Ethan had already promised her a window seat on the way home, too. He announced that every passenger on the flight would receive a full refund, along with a travel voucher, not as compensation for inconvenience, but as an acknowledgement that something had gone wrong that never should have happened in the first place. He said the airline would be reviewing every complaint filed over the past 5 years involving passengers judged on appearance or circumstance rather than treated on their merits, not just the ones tied to this particular crew. Liberty Air's customer satisfaction scores in first class had climbed higher than at any point in the airline's history, though Diane made a point of telling her team that the number that mattered most to her wasn't the score itself, but the shrinking count of complaints that looked anything like the one filed on Flight 347, closing the exact loophole that had let 3 prior complaints against Rebecca and Kevin's crew disappear without consequence. A direct reporting channel was created, so complaints could no longer be absorbed and forgotten at the local level, and every regional manager was required to review flagged incidents personally rather than delegate them downward. Diane Bennett was placed in charge of overseeing the rollout personally, a role she had not asked for, but did not resist either. Within a year, 6 months later, Ethan booked the same route again, the same evening departure flight 347 from New York to San Francisco. This time, he was not traveling alone. His son sat beside him in the middle seat, still talking excitedly about a baseball tournament 2 towns over, and his daughter sat by the window, her small hand pressed against the glass as the ground crew moved equipment below. She had brought a new drawing this time, folded carefully into the pocket of her backpack, telling her it was the best airplane picture she had seen all week, and his daughter beamed the rest of the way to her seat. His daughter said yes so quickly that Ethan laughed out loud, the sound surprising him a little, since laughter on an airplane had not always come easily. The service that followed was unhurried and genuine, the kind that did not depend on anyone knowing who Ethan was or what he had once done for the airline. Outside the window, a flight attendant he did not recognize greeted them warmly at the door, crouching slightly to speak directly to his daughter and asking if she'd like a coloring page for the flight. Before they reached their seats, his daughter pulled the new drawing free from her backpack and held it up for the attendant to see 3 stick figures now, instead of 2 with a small dog. She had been begging Ethan to consider, added in the corner for good measure. The attendant crouched down to admire it properly. During a lull in the flight, Robert made his way back to Ethan's row and crouched beside the armrest for a moment. Different crew, different flight, he said. And it actually feels different. Whatever changed after that night, it stuck. He glanced at the 2 children before adding, quieter, "Good to see you flying with backup this time." Ethan thanked him, and for a moment, neither man said anything else. The quiet between them comfortable in a way that only made sense to 2 people who had once stood on the same side of something difficult. For just a moment, Ethan thought of Sarah and the promise he had made to himself on a much harder flight 3 years earlier. He liked to think she would have recognized this version of him, tired in all the same ordinary ways, but steadier now in the ways that mattered. The sky had turned the deep orange of a Pacific sunset, the kind his daughter always insisted on narrating, out loud, color by color, until the plane leveled into darkness. Partway through the flight, as the crew moved through the cabin, refilling drinks, Ethan noticed a familiar face, 2 rows up a man in a gray sport coat, glancing back toward him with a small nod of recognition. It was Robert Whitman, the passenger who had spoken up for him months earlier, without hesitation. Ethan looked at his children, his son already dozing against the window, his daughter carefully coloring a picture of an airplane with a bright yellow sun above it, and felt something settle in his chest that had nothing to do with vindication and everything to do with quiet relief. Dignity was never supposed to depend on a title or a business card, he said. It's supposed to start the moment someone walks through the door. Tonight, it finally did.